If you really want to know the truth, there is nothing more depressing than a wealthy New Year's Eve party. You have all these phonies standing around in rented tuxedos, grinning like morons and pretending they aren't sharks waiting to smell blood. It's enough to make you lose your lunch. I'm Floral Ray, and I had to watch my own parents treat me like a piece of furniture they were tired of looking at. They missed my graduation to design a logo, then fired me for my idiot brother because I was too technical. It really knocks you out how fast family turns on you when there's money involved. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. But before the champagne went flat, I decided to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The crystal flutes chimed against one another, a delicate, expensive sound that pierced through the murmuring crowd filling the Ray Estate's grand ballroom. It was New Year's Eve, the air heavy with the scent of imported lilies and the distinct metallic tang of ambition. A string quartet sat in the corner sawing away at Vivaldi with a frantic energy that matched the room's desperation, though everyone here pretended to be at ease. I stood near the French doors, my back pressed against the cold glass, nursing a sparkling water that had long since gone flat. I wasn't here to celebrate the turning of the calendar. I was here to witness the end of an era, though nobody else in the room knew it yet. To my left, a cluster of men in bespoke tuxedos laughed too loudly at a joke made by my father, Richard Ray. Beside him stood my mother, Martha, her smile plastered on with the same rigidity as her hairspray. They looked the part of the manufacturing royalty. They believed themselves to be titans of industry, pillars of the community, the proud owners of Raychem. But their eyes kept darting toward the center of the room where my younger brother Austin was holding court. Austin, who had never worked a full 40-hour week in his life, was currently swirling a glass of 25-year-old scotch, gesturing wildly as he explained his vision to a group of skeptical investors who were too polite to walk away. I watched them with a clinical detachment that surprised even me. A month ago, this scene would have broken my heart. Now it just confirmed my hypothesis. The Ray family valued flash over substance, and tonight was the ultimate exhibition of that flaw. My gaze drifted from the gilded crown molding to the faces of the guests. They weren't friends. In the Ray household, we didn't have friends. We had business associates, suppliers, and people who wanted something. Tonight, they wanted to know if the rumors were true, if the company was truly shifting direction. My parents were betting everything on this night, on this party, and on Austin. It was a gamble made on a foundation of sand, but they were too busy admiring the view to check the ground beneath their feet. I took a small sip of water, the bubbles gone tasting only of minerals and silence. Silence was something I had become accustomed to over the last few weeks. It was the same silence that had greeted me when I walked across the stage at the university auditorium just 30 days prior. I had graduated top of my class summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering. It wasn't a degree I chose for passion, it was a degree I chose for utility. Raychem's entire manufacturing process was outdated, bleeding money on inefficient thermal cycles and waste disposal. For 4 years, I had studied fluid dynamics and thermodynamics with a single goal to return home and retrofit the plant, saving the family legacy from its own obsolescence. I had sent the invitation to the ceremony 3 months in advance. I had reminded them weekly. Yet when they called my name, Floral Ray, and I walked across that stage to accept the diploma that represented thousands of hours of sleepless nights and grueling calculation, the seats reserved for the Ray family were empty. No father, no mother, certainly no brother. Just 3 empty folding chairs gathering dust in the auditorium lighting. I drove home that night with the diploma on the passenger seat, telling myself there must have been an emergency. A fire at the plant, a supply chain crisis, a medical issue. When I arrived at the estate the next morning, luggage in hand, ready to start my tenure as the head of operations, a position promised to me by my father explicitly, when I started my freshman year, I found no emergency. I found a branding agency. The house was filled with storyboards, color swatches, and logo designs. My parents were sitting in the solarium drinking mimosas with a team of creatives from the city. When I asked why they missed the graduation, my mother hadn't even looked up from a swatch of fabric. "Oh, Floral, don't be dramatic," she had said, waving a hand adorned with a diamond that cost more than my tuition. "We're in the middle of a total rebrand. We simply couldn't get away. This is the future of Raychem we're dealing with." I had swallowed the hurt, pushing it down into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I told them I was ready to start work. I had my thesis on polymer efficiency in my bag, ready to implement changes that would save the company $2 million in the first quarter alone. That was when the real blow landed. My father, Richard, had cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at me. "About that Floral," he had said, his voice taking on that oily, patronizing tone he used with union representatives. "We've been doing some thinking. The chemical side of things. It's messy, it's technical, it's boring. The market wants story, the market wants youth." He gestured to Austin, who had walked in wearing sunglasses indoors, hungover from a night out I wasn't invited to. "Austin has a vision. He gets the vibe we're going for. We're making him the face of the new Raychem, president of operations." I had stood there, my knuckles white on the handle of my suitcase. "Austin dropped out of business school," I reminded them, my voice steady despite the ringing in my ears. "He doesn't know the difference between a covalent bond and a municipal bond. We manufacture aerospace adhesives, Dad. If the chemistry is wrong, planes fall out of the sky." "See," my mother had interjected, pointing at me with her champagne flute. That right there. You're too rigid, Floral, too obsessed with the technicalities. It's off-putting. It's not the energy we want for the relaunch. We need you to step aside. We're letting you go." They fired me. They didn't just rescind the job offer, they kicked me out of the business entirely. They offered me a pitiful severance and told me to take a vacation to find myself, while Austin took my office and my future. They chose the sizzle and threw away the steak. But in their haste to discard me, in their arrogance to rebrand a company they barely understood, they had forgotten the most basic rule of business: check the assets. They assumed that because I was their daughter, everything I created belonged to them. They were wrong. Back in the ballroom, the clock chimed the quarter hour. Austin was laughing now, spilling a bit of his scotch on the expensive Persian rug. My mother rushed over, not to scold him, but to dab at his lapel with a napkin, cooing over him as if he were a toddler who had scraped his knee. The incompetence was staggering. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't earned, funded by a product they no longer had the right to sell. I watched Austin clap a heavy hand on the shoulder of a banker from the city, leaning in to whisper some confidential nonsense that was likely illegal, incorrect, or both. The anger I felt wasn't hot or fiery. It was absolute zero. It was the cold clarity of a mathematical equation finally balancing out. I tightened my grip on the glass. Let them have their champagne. Let them have their string quartet and their hollow toasts. They had ignored my graduation because they were too busy rebranding. Well, I had done some rebranding of my own. I checked my watch. 45 minutes until midnight. 45 minutes until the carriage turned back into a pumpkin, and the Ray family realized that the engine of their wealth had walked out the door with the girl they didn't bother to celebrate. I took a sip of water and waited. The show was just beginning. The irony of the champagne flutes and the black tie dress code was that Raychem was at its heart a dirty business. We didn't sell luxury, we sold adhesion. Specifically, we manufactured a high-viscosity, thermally stable epoxy resin used in the structural bonding of commercial aircraft fuselage panels. It was unsexy, industrial, and invisible to the average consumer, but it was the only reason my parents could afford the crystal chandeliers vibrating above my head. As I watched the room swirl with forced laughter, my mind drifted away from the social performativity and into the mechanics of our solvency. To the investors sipping their drinks, Raychem was a legacy brand. To my father, it was a piggy bank. But to me, it was a chemical formula. 3 years ago, during the summer between my sophomore and junior years, I had taken an unpaid internship in our R&D lab, a basement facility that smelled of acetone and neglect. The company was bleeding cash, then struggling to compete with cheaper imports. I spent 3 months living on vending machine coffee tweaking polymerization rates until I cracked the code for a resin that cured 40% faster than the market standard while maintaining higher shear strength. It was a breakthrough that saved the company. It was the Ray Chem miracle. But there was a detail about that miracle that my father, in his infinite greed, had structured to his own detriment. At the time of the invention, the company was facing a liquidity crisis and a potential audit. My father, Richard, was terrified that if the company declared bankruptcy, the creditors would seize the intellectual property of the new formula, our only valuable asset. He thought he was being a genius tax strategist. He instructed the corporate lawyers to register the patent not in the company's name, but in mine. I was 21, a dependent, and in his eyes a permanent extension of his will. The plan was simple. I would hold the patent personally to shield it from corporate liability, and I would sign a licensing agreement granting Raychem the exclusive right to manufacture the adhesive for $1 a year. It was a shell game designed to hide assets, a trick he bragged about at dinner parties. But contracts are precise instruments, unlike my father's loyalty. I remembered the day I signed that licensing agreement. I sat in his office, the mahogany desk looking vast and intimidating, and read the fine print. Clause 4.2. The exclusivity and rights granted herein are conditional upon the licensor's active full-time employment within the licensee's corporate structure. Termination of employment for any reason immediately voids all rights granted under this agreement. My father had insisted on that clause ironically to protect himself. He wanted to ensure that if I ever ran off to join a commune or find myself, the company wouldn't be on the hook for royalties. He never imagined a scenario where he would fire me. He couldn't conceive of a world where he didn't control me. By firing me last week to make room for Austin, he hadn't just removed an employee. He had legally severed Raychem's access to its only profitable product. The moment the HR director, a woman who couldn't look me in the eye, handed me my termination notice, the clock started ticking. Raychem was currently manufacturing a product they no longer had the legal right to touch. A shadow fell over me, blocking the light from the sconces. I turned to find Austin standing there, his tuxedo jacket already unbuttoned, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He held a thick manila envelope in one hand and a fresh drink in the other. He didn't look like an executive. He looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. "Floral," he said, slurring slightly, the ice clinking in his glass. "Hiding in the corner classic. You know Mom's worried you're going to make a scene." I straightened my posture, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "I'm just observing Austin. It's an educational evening." He snorted a jagged, ugly sound. "Yeah, well, education's over. It's time for business." He thrust the envelope toward me, nearly knocking the water out of my hand. "Dad wants this sorted before the midnight toast. Loose ends and all that." I took the envelope, the paper heavy and textured. I didn't need to open it to know what it was, but I did anyway, pulling out the staple-bound document. It was a consulting agreement. They were offering me a stipend, less than the cost of the catering, for this party to remain available for technical inquiries. But attached to the back was the real weapon, a non-disclosure agreement, and a draconian non-compete clause. "It's a standard package," Austin said, waving his hand dismissively. 35 grand a year. Basically free money for you. You just sign there, agree not to talk about the company business, and agree not to work for anyone else in the chemical sector for, let's see, 10 years. Keeps things clean." He grinned, a predatory expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Since you're so smart, you can see it's a good deal. Nobody hires female engineers with attitude problems anyway. Dad's doing you a favor." The insult was designed to provoke me, to make me emotional, so I would either sign to get him to leave or storm out in a huff. I felt the familiar burn of indignation, the urge to throw my drink in his face and scream about my GPA, my research, and the long nights in the lab while he was partying in Ibiza. But I forced the temperature down. Emotion was a variable I couldn't afford. If I signed this, the non-compete would supersede the patent license termination. I would be legally bound to silence, unable to execute the second half of my plan. If I refused outright, Austin might cause a scene now, alerting our father before the trap was sprung. I needed to stall. I needed him to walk away, thinking he had won just for another hour. I flipped to the signature page, pretending to read the text closely. My eyes scanned the boilerplate legal jargon until I found what I needed. Not a real error, but something bureaucratic enough to confuse a man who had never read a contract in his life. "Austin," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can't sign this." His face flushed red, his jaw tightening. "Don't start with me, Floral. Dad said—" I cut him off, holding up the document and pointing to the header. "No, look. The entity listed here, it says Raychem Holdings LLC, but the operating company, the one that actually pays the payroll, is Raychem Manufacturing Inc. If I sign this with the wrong entity listed, the contract is void ab initio. It wouldn't protect you or Dad. In fact, it might expose you to an audit if the IRS sees you paying consultants from the holding shell." It was absolute gibberish. The entities were interchangeable for this purpose, and he would have known that if he knew anything about the business he was about to lead. But Austin was terrified of looking stupid. He squinted at the paper, his brow furrowing as he tried to parse the words. "The holding shell," he mumbled, trying to regain his composure. "Right. Yeah. Obviously. Stupid lawyers." I nodded sympathetically. "Exactly. Look, I want to sign this. I want the money, Austin. 35 grand is generous." I lied through my teeth, stroking his ego. "But I need a corrected copy. If I sign this one, it's useless to you. Why don't you go find Dad's lawyer?" "He's here somewhere. Tell him to reprint it with the manufacturing Inca header. I'll wait right here. We can sign it just after the midnight announcement. That way we don't spoil the vibe right now with paperwork." Austin hesitated, looking from me to the document. He wanted the victory now, but the fear of a void contract and the potential wrath of our father if he messed up the paperwork outweighed his impatience. He snatched the folder back from my hands. "Fine," he snapped, "but don't move. I'm going to get this fixed, and then you're signing. And then you're going to smile when I go up on that stage." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said, offering him a thin, tight smile. He turned on his heel and marched back into the crowd, the conquering hero on a mission to fix a typo. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He had taken the bait. He wouldn't find the lawyer in time. I had seen the legal counsel leaving 20 minutes ago with a migraine. Austin would spend the next crucial hour chasing his tail, leaving me free to watch the clock tick down to 0. The paper trail was laid. All that was left was the match. The grandfather clock in the hallway began its low, rhythmic thrumming, signaling 10 minutes to midnight. The sound was almost lost beneath the swell of the string quartet and the cacophony of polite society drunk on expensive liquor, but I heard it. It was the sound of a fuse burning down. My father Richard stepped onto the small raised dais at the front of the ballroom, a spoon clinking sharply against his crystal flute. The room quieted in waves, the silence rippling outward from him, until the only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and the nervous shifting of silk and wool. He looked every inch the patriarch. His silver hair perfectly coiffed his tuxedo, straining slightly at the buttons, a man who believed he was the architect of his own universe. Beside him, Austin stood beaming, swaying slightly, the corrected contract, likely crumpled in his pocket, forgotten in the thrill of the spotlight. I moved from the periphery, stepping out of the shadows of the heavy velvet drapes and positioning myself near the center aisle, a calculated vector that would give me a direct line of sight to the stage. "Friends, colleagues, visionaries," Richard boomed, his voice projected with the practiced cadence of a man used to boardroom monologues. "We stand here tonight on the precipice of a new year, but more importantly, a new era. For 40 years, Raychem has been a steady ship. But steady is another word for slow. And in this market, if you aren't moving fast, you're dying." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd, investors who wanted faster returns, unaware they were about to lose their principal. Richard placed a heavy hand on Austin's shoulder. We've made some difficult choices this month. We've trimmed the fat. We've shed the dead weight of the old ways to make room for the new. Tonight we retire the Ray Chem name. At the stroke of midnight, we become Ray X. A projector screen behind them flickered to life, displaying a jagged, aggressive logo in neon blue that looked more like an energy drink label than an aerospace manufacturing firm. There was a smattering of applause, mostly from the younger consultants Austin had hired. And leading this charge, Richard continued, is a man with the fire to burn down the competition, my son Austin Ray. Austin stepped forward, soaking in the applause, raising his glass high. Richard wasn't finished, though. He needed to twist the knife one last time, a final assertion of dominance to justify his decisions. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sliding over me without a flicker of recognition or regret. Some people, he chuckled, the sound wet and condescending, think business is about formulas. They think it's about what you learn in a library. We had some of that thinking in the family recently. Some of us study books, but Rays make money. The crowd laughed, a polite, cruel titter that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was a direct public humiliation, dismissing my entire existence, my degree, my research, my dedication as a cute, irrelevant hobby. My mother, standing to the side, clapped the loudest, her eyes shining with adoration for the son who was currently struggling to keep his eyes focused. That laughter was the signal. It was the catalyst that finalized the reaction. "Excuse me, Richard," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I projected my voice from the diaphragm, a technique I'd learned presenting defenses in lecture halls. The clarity of my tone cut through the laughter like a scalpel. The room went dead silent. Heads turned. My father froze, his smile faltering into a mask of annoyance. "Floral!" he hissed the microphone, picking up the edge in his voice. "This isn't the time. We're in the middle of a toast." I walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor, creating a tempo of impending doom. I didn't look at the guests. I kept my eyes locked on the stage. "Actually, this is exactly the time," I said, stopping 10 feet from the dais. "Because you're about to ask these people to invest in a company that as of 7 days ago no longer has a product." Austin stepped in front of our father, his face flushing a mottled red. "Security," he muttered, waving a hand vaguely. "Someone get her out of here. She's upset she didn't get a pony." "I'm not upset, Austin," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, more clinical. "I'm litigious. Did you check the intellectual property portfolio before you designed that logo?" Austin scoffed. "IP. We own everything. It's Ray Chem. It's the family business." "Correction," I said, raising my voice slightly to ensure the back of the room could hear. "The family business owns the building. It owns the machines. It owns the trucks. But it does not own the formula for the RC90 adhesive. That patent belongs to me." A ripple of whispering broke out among the investors. Richard stepped past Austin, his face darkening. "Floral, stop this nonsense immediately. You licensed that patent to us years ago. It's a done deal. Sit down or leave." "I did license it to you," I agreed, pulling a folded document from my clutch. "It wasn't the consulting agreement. It was a copy of the original licensing contract, the paper worn soft from how many times I had read it. I licensed it to Raychem under strict terms. Clause 4.2. I recited it from memory, staring directly into my father's eyes. "The license is valid only so long as the licensor Floral Ray is employed by the licensee. Termination of employment for any reason immediately voids all rights granted under this agreement." I paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "You fired me last Tuesday, Dad. You signed the termination letter yourself. In doing so, you didn't just fire your daughter, you fired the adhesive. As of that moment, Ray Chem, or Ray X, or whatever you want to call it, has been manufacturing counterfeit goods using stolen intellectual property." Richard's face went pale, the blood draining away to leave him looking old and frail. He knew the clause. He remembered it now. He had written it to trap me, and instead he had built his own guillotine. But Austin, fueled by ignorance and whiskey, wasn't ready to fold. He let out a barking laugh, stepping to the edge of the stage. So what? He sneered. It's a piece of paper, Floral. We have the factory, we have the tanks, we know how to mix the goop. You think a piece of paper is going to stop the production line? We'll just make it anyway. Who's going to stop us? You. He looked around the room, seeking validation. She thinks she can stop a factory with a piece of paper. No, I said softly. I don't think I can stop you. I know I can't. I'm just an engineer. I don't have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle against my own family. Austin grinned, thinking he had called my bluff. Exactly, so sit down. However, I continued checking my watch, 5 minutes to midnight. I knew you wouldn't respect my rights, so I found someone who has the resources to make you respect them. Someone who has been trying to crack the aerospace market for a decade but lacked the right formula. I turned my back on the stage and faced the double doors at the entrance of the ballroom. I believe you know the CEO of Sterling Synthetics. The doors swung open as if on cue. The silence that fell over the room this time wasn't polite, it was terrified. Entering the room was not a guest, but a predator. Mr. Sterling was a man of sharp angles and expensive tailoring, known in the industry as the Shark. He was Ray Chem's fiercest competitor, a man my father had spent 20 years cursing at the dinner table. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases, corporate counsel. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide berth as Sterling walked toward me. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at the trembling Austin. He looked only at me. Miss Ray, Sterling said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried effortlessly. Is it time? It is, Mr. Sterling, I replied. I turned back to my family, who looked as if they were watching a ghost materialize. Austin asked who was going to stop him. The answer is Sterling Synthetics. I held up the second document I had brought. Yesterday afternoon, I signed an exclusive global licensing agreement with Mr. Sterling. The patent for the RC90 adhesive now belongs exclusively to his fleet. And since you are no longer the licensee, any production by Raychem is a direct violation of federal patent law. Sterling stepped up beside me, offering a terrifyingly pleasant smile to my father. One of his lawyers stepped forward and placed a thick envelope on the edge of the dais right at Richard's feet. Richard, Sterling said, nodding cordially. That is a cease and desist order. It is effective as of midnight tonight. If a single ounce of that adhesive leaves your loading dock after the clock strikes 12, my legal team will file an injunction that will freeze your assets so fast your head will spin. And since you've been producing it without a license for the last week, well, we'll be discussing damages for that too. You can't, Richard stammered, gripping the podium for support. Floral, you can't do this. This is the family legacy. The legacy you kicked me out of, I reminded him. The legacy you said needed vision. Well, here is my vision, Dad. I sold the rights. I received a 7-figure advance, and I retained a royalty percentage on every gallon Sterling sells. I'm not just an engineer anymore. I'm a partner at the biggest chemical firm in the state. Austin looked like he was going to be sick. The investors in the room were already pulling out their phones, making frantic calls to kill deals before the morning bell. The rebranding wasn't a launch. It was a funeral. 3 minutes to midnight, I said, looking at the clock. I suggest you use the remaining time to figure out how you're going to fulfill your contracts with glue. You can't make in a factory you can't afford to run. My mother let out a sob, collapsing into a chair. Richard stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and horror. He realized finally that the boring girl with the books had just dismantled his empire without raising a hand. I turned to Mr. Sterling and extended my hand. Happy New Year, Mr. Sterling. He took my hand, his grip firm and warm. Happy New Year, Floral. Welcome to the winning team. As our hands clasped, the grandfather clock began to chime. Dong, dong, the sound of the new year arriving, the sound of the old world dying. I didn't watch my family crumble. I just listened to the bell, counting the strokes, knowing that when the 12th chime faded, Raychem would be nothing more than a memory. The last chime of the grandfather clock faded, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy pressing down on the ballroom like a physical weight. The cease and desist order lay on the dais, where Mr. Sterling's lawyer had placed it, a stark white rectangle against the dark polished wood of the floor. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the spell broke, and the room dissolved into a chaos that was all the more terrifying for how quiet it was. There were no screams, no overturned tables. Instead, there was the swift, brutal efficiency of capital fleeing a sinking ship. The investors, men and women who had spent decades honing their instincts for disaster, didn't wait for an explanation. They understood the implications of what I had just said better than my own family did. They knew that a manufacturing company without a product was just a liability with a payroll. Phones were pulled from tuxedo pockets. I heard the hushed, urgent tones of men instructing their brokers to dump stock, to cancel transfers, to pull term sheets. The Ray X logo on the projector screen behind my father flickered a cruel joke illuminating his ruin. My father, Richard, stood frozen on the stage, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked from the legal document to the retreating backs of his friends, and finally his gaze landed on Austin. The explosion was inevitable. "You said you checked the assets," Richard roared, his voice cracking with a panic I had never heard before. "Austin, you told me you reviewed the IP portfolio. You said the transition was airtight." Austin, who had been so arrogant only moments ago, shrank back looking like a child caught playing with matches. I thought the lawyers handled it," he stammered, backing away until he bumped into the drum kit of the confused jazz band. "You told me to focus on the brand, Dad. You said the technical stuff was boring. You said, just make it look cool, Austin. That's what I did." "I told you to run the company," Richard shouted, stepping off the dais and advancing on his son. "Running the company means knowing if we actually own the product we sell, you imbecile." My mother, Martha, rushed between them, clutching her pearls as if they were a talisman against bankruptcy. "Richard, stop, not here, not in front of everyone." She turned to the crowd, forcing a rictus of a smile. "Please, everyone, just a small misunderstanding. There is plenty of champagne." But nobody was listening to her. The guests were filing out the double doors, averting their eyes, desperate to disassociate themselves from the Ray name before the stink of failure stuck to them. I watched the implosion with Mr. Sterling standing silently at my shoulder, a sentinel of my new reality. It was a fascinating study in disintegration. The family unit, which they had claimed was so important when they were kicking me out, was shredding itself apart over a profit margin. Austin, cornered and terrified, lashed out. "This is your fault," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at our parents. "You fired her. You told me she was useless. You said, get rid of Floral and the company will soar. You set me up." "We gave you an empire," Richard bellowed back, his face purple, "and you lost it in a week because you were too lazy to read a contract." The accusation hung in the air, true and devastating. Then Richard's eyes snapped to me. The rage in them flickered, replaced by a sudden desperate calculation. He saw Mr. Sterling. He saw the lawyers. And he saw the only exit strategy left. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and walked toward me. He stepped over the cease and desist order without looking down. "Floral," he said, his voice dropping to that reasonable paternal tone he used when he wanted me to work overtime for free. Let's take a breath here. We're all emotional. It's New Year's Eve after all." He tried to smile, but it looked like a grimace. "Mr. Sterling, if you could give us a moment, family business." "I am her business partner now, Richard," Sterling said, his voice like grinding stones. "I stay." My father flinched but didn't retreat. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Floral, darling, look at what you've done. You've made your point. You're smart. You're capable. We see that now. We underestimated you." He gestured vaguely toward the weeping Austin. "Your brother, he's not ready. I see that now. He doesn't have the discipline, but you do." He took a step closer, extending his hands. "Tear up the contract with Sterling. Come back to us. We'll reinstate you, not just as head of operations, CEO. We'll fire Austin. We'll send him to rehab or business school or wherever. You run the show. It's your legacy, Floral. It's your name on the building. Don't destroy your own heritage for a stranger." It was a seductive offer. A year ago, I would have killed for it. I would have wept with gratitude to hear my father say I was capable. But now all I saw was a man trying to buy a life raft with currency he didn't have. I looked at Austin sobbing into his hands while our mother patted his back. Then I looked at my father. "You're offering me the captain's chair on the Titanic after you've already hit the iceberg," I said, my voice calm and even. "But that's not why I'm saying no." "We can fix it," Richard interrupted, desperation leaking through. "We can renegotiate. We're family. Blood is thicker than water." "Floral, is it?" I asked. "Because last week when you fired me, you didn't talk about blood. You talked about synergy and branding. You talked about how I didn't fit the image." I took a step forward, forcing him to look up at me. "You ignored my graduation, Dad. You missed the defining moment of my professional life because you were busy planning this party. You were busy planning how to replace me with him." I pointed at Austin. "You didn't care about my competence then. You only care about it now because you need it to save your bank account. That's not love. That's not family. That's just resource management. And I am no longer a resource you can manage." Richard's face crumbled. He looked old suddenly. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a frightened man who had gambled everything on the wrong child. "Floral, please," he whispered. "We'll lose everything. The house, the estate, everything." "You should have thought of that before you violated Clause 4(2), I said. I turned to Mr. Sterling. "I'm ready to go." Sterling nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. He placed a hand on my back, guiding me toward the exit. We walked past the remaining guests, who parted like the Red Sea. We walked past the expensive catering that would go uneaten. We walked past my mother, who was looking at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion, as if she couldn't understand how the daughter she raised to be silent had suddenly learned to speak. "Floral!" Austin screamed after me, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. You're ruining my life." I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the open door where the cold, clean air of the new year was waiting. "You ruined your own life, Austin," I said, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me over his own self-pity. "I just signed the paperwork." We stepped out onto the grand portico. The valet was already waiting with Mr. Sterling's car, the engine running, the exhaust pluming white in the chill night air. Behind me, inside the mansion, the shouting had started again. My father screaming, my mother crying, the sound of a glass shattering against a wall. It was the soundtrack of a kingdom collapsing. I slid into the back seat of the sedan, the leather cool against my skin. Mr. Sterling got in beside me. "To the office?" he asked. I looked back at the house one last time, seeing the silhouette of my father in the window, a small, angry shadow against the light. "No," I said, facing forward. "To the future." The car pulled away, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, leaving the wreckage of Raychem in the rearview mirror, shrinking until it was gone. 3 months in the corporate world is a lifetime. In that short span, empires can rise, and as I have personally witnessed, they can crumble into dust. I sat in my corner office on the 24th floor of the Sterling Synthetics headquarters, watching the rain streak against the glass. The view was magnificent, a panoramic sweep of the city skyline that made the Ray estate look like a dollhouse in comparison. But I wasn't looking at the view. I was looking at the quarterly acquisition report lying on my mahogany desk. It was a dry spreadsheet-heavy document, the kind my brother would have thrown in the trash, but to me, it was poetry. It detailed the final liquidation assets of Raychem Manufacturing, Inc., purchased by Sterling Synthetics for 18 cents on the dollar. The collapse of my father's company hadn't been the dramatic explosion Austin had feared, it was a suffocation. Without the license to the RC90 adhesive, Raychem had defaulted on its 3 major aerospace contracts within 48 hours of the New Year's Eve party. The penalties for non-delivery were catastrophic, triggering immediate liquidity clauses from their creditors. My father had tried to fight it, of course. He blustered and threatened hiring expensive lawyers he couldn't afford, trying to argue that the patent license was implied by familial bond. The judge, a woman with a background in contract law, had dismissed his motion in less than 20 minutes. The law does not recognize vibes, as Austin might say. It recognizes signatures. The acquisition was ruthless and total. Mr. Sterling, true to his nature, didn't just want the market share. He wanted the infrastructure. Last week, I walked through the old Ray Chem factory floor not as a daughter or an employee, but as the new director of innovation for the parent company. It was a surreal experience to see the Ray X banners half-hung and gathering dust being pulled down by work crews wearing sterling blue. We bought the reactors, the mixing tanks, and the fleet of trucks. We even bought the office furniture. I made a specific request to have my father's executive chair removed and replaced with a standard ergonomic model for the new plant manager. We were keeping the workforce, the machinists and line workers who actually knew what they were doing, but the management layer was being scraped away like rust. It was the ultimate efficiency correction. The parasite of incompetence had been removed, and the host organism could finally thrive. As for the parasites themselves, the fallout was absolute. My mother called me once about a month ago. She didn't call to apologize. She called to ask for a loan. She explained through a veil of histrionic tears that the bank had foreclosed on the estate. The branding exercise and the party had drained their cash reserves, and the contract penalties took the rest. Richard and Martha Ray were currently living in a 2-bedroom rented condo on the outskirts of the city, a place with thin walls and no room for a string quartet. She told me I was cruel, that I had forgotten where I came from. I told her that I remembered exactly where I came from. I came from a university library where I earned a degree. She didn't respect to build a product she didn't understand. I declined the loan. I did, however, offer to send her a list of job openings in retail, noting that they were hiring for entry-level positions. She hung up on me, and the silence that followed was far more peaceful than any conversation we'd ever had. Austin fared even worse. Incompetence in business is usually just a firing offense, but lying to investors is a felony. When the company collapsed, the investors who had been at the party started asking questions about the projections Austin had shown them. It turned out he had fabricated purchase orders to inflate the company's valuation for the rebranding launch. He is currently facing civil lawsuits for misrepresentation and fraud, and there is a very real possibility of criminal charges from the SEC. He is unemployable in the chemical industry or any industry that requires a background check. The last I heard, he was trying to become a lifestyle influencer on social media, spinning a narrative about being a victim of corporate sabotage. He has 300 followers, and none of them can bail him out of legal trouble. I turned my chair away from the window and looked at the wall opposite my desk. There, centered in a simple black frame, hung my diploma. Chemical engineering, summa cum laude. My parents had seen it as a piece of paper, a prop that didn't matter as much as a charming smile or a firm handshake. They were wrong. That piece of paper was the deed to my freedom. It was the proof that value isn't inherited, it is generated. I reached for my coffee mug, a plain white ceramic cup, no logos, no branding, just functional. The coffee was hot and bitter, exactly how I liked it. Mr. Sterling had given me full autonomy over the R&D division. My budget was triple what it had been at Raychem, and nobody asked me to fetch coffee or smile more. Here I was, judged solely on the yield of my equations and the strength of my bonds. It was a cold, hard world, and I loved it. I took a sip, savoring the quiet hum of the HVAC system, the sound of a well-oiled machine running at peak efficiency. The ledger was balanced, the debt was paid. And for the first time in my life, the new year didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a promise kept. That concludes the story of Floral Ray, a powerful reminder that competence is the only currency that truly matters. Do you think her family deserved to lose everything? Or was Floral's calculated revenge too harsh for her own flesh and blood? Hit that subscribe button and let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.